Hi, this is Bernadette from Murderific True Crime Podcast in Portland, Maine, and you are listening to California Dreaming on the Orbital Jigsaw Network.
This episode of California Dreaming is brought to you by BLUBRRY. Creating a podcast isn't that simple. It's more than just recording yourself and uploading it. To really get your show to be everything you want it to be, you're gonna need a little more than that. You need easy, reliable hosting so your time can be spent creating your content, the most accurate download stats so you know if you're reaching the audience you're wanting to, and a web page that makes setting up totally easy on you and won't take up too much of your valuable time. And BLUBRRRY offers all of this and more for hosts and aspiring hosts alike. Simple media hosting, a fully integrated WordPress website with their PowerPress sites. So if you already have a podcast or you've always dreamed about starting one, head over to www.orbitaljigsaw.com/dream to sign up, and the first month is on us. The BLUBRRRY support team is available to walk you through the steps of migrating your show without losing any subscribers, or to help you get started in the process of launching your new show. With the first month for free, using promo code DREAM, you've got no more excuses. So, let's get started. I would like to take the time to thank all of you for continuing to support California Dreaming on social media by following us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, as well as for everyone who has left a review for the show on Apple Podcasts or whichever platforms you listen to us on, by spreading the word by recommending California Dreaming in listening groups, and of course for supporting us on Patreon as well. There are more than 25 exclusive bonuses on Patreon, and for as little as $1 a month, you can gain access to almost all of those episodes as well. I did manage to pull off a second bonus this month for those who support us at the $5 tier and above, and it is a fascinating story, and I don't think many of you have heard it before. I've gotten lots of great feedback so far about it, so if you are at the $5 and up levels, go check that out and leave your comments on Patreon or on Facebook. I would love to know what you all think about it. I also had a button giveaway this week for patrons at the $5 level and above as well. Those will be coming out to you very soon. I'm really bad about going to the post office, but I will get there, I promise. And those of you who raised your support this week, Connie L., Renee C., Elaine F., Allison M., Linda B., and Maureen S., thank you. I would also like to thank brand new patrons Stacy W., Paul K., and Rory C. And if you would like to make a one-time donation instead of joining Patreon to help support the production of California Dreaming, you can do so through our PayPal using email californiapod@gmail.com. Thanks again, everyone, for all of your support. So, dreamers, a thing happened in American history. Many, many of you, if not all of you, are aware of this event. President Franklin D. Roosevelt gave a speech about it on December 8th, 1941, in referring to the events of the previous day, December 7th. He referred to it as a date which will live in infamy. His speech continued. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan was still in conversation with its governor and its emperor, looking towards the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. You know what Roosevelt was talking about. Pearl Harbor. And you know what happened next. We were thrust into World War II. And 2 months later, another thing happened. By February of 1942, it was decided that Japanese Americans residing in the United States were classified as threats to national security, at which time they were subsequently rounded up and placed into internment camps set up at various locations around the country. If a person had been determined to have had as much as a drop of Japanese ancestry in their blood, they were interred. At the time, of the 127,000 Japanese Americans living in the United States, about 112,000 of them lived along the Pacific coast. So many Japanese Californians were ordered into the internment camps. As the United States was preparing for war, two more things happened that deeply impacted California in the wake of the attacks on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent internment of Japanese Americans. Those two things were the Bracero program and the Second Great Migration, and I'll go over those briefly. The Bracero program, which is derived from the Spanish word bracero, which translates to manual laborer, was a set of diplomacy agreements that began on August 4th, 1942. The first one to be signed with Mexico was called the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement. And what this did was promise livable conditions, meaning proper sanitation accommodations, as well as a place to live and food, along with a pay rate of 30 cents an hour, which even today would be a pathetically low wage, as when I put that into the inflation calculator, it only amounts to $4.72. The agreement also was extended to include workers hailing from the island of Guam, and all of this was meant to be a temporary solution to help supplement the labor shortage in the agricultural industry. And with the enactment of this agreement, California experienced a tremendous influx of workers from Mexico. The agreement would go on to be extended all the way until it was terminated in 1964. As for the Second Great Migration, that involved the migration of as many as 5 million African Americans who relocated from southern states to the northeastern parts of the United States, the Midwest, and out here to the west. The migration started as early as 1940, continued on through World War II, all the way up until the early 70s. When it comes to California, Los Angeles and Oakland were cities African Americans were relocating to, where they were able to take advantage of more skilled jobs, such as working in shipyards and in the defense industry, and it was more than the South had to offer at the time. And because there was still a climate of deep discrimination in the South, it was also a chance for them to move far away from that as well. Prior to these two initiatives that led to a large and rapid flood of workers from both Mexico and African American backgrounds, the California population had been predominantly white. These people were coming from all across the country and across the border, and with it came elevated racial tensions. But it was even more so in the city of Los Angeles. And in the midst of all this, the death of one young Mexican-American man would lead to a call to action to rid the streets of mostly Latino Americans in Los Angeles, but also other minorities. And it was an action led by throngs of United States military personnel, off-duty law enforcement officers, as well as regular citizens who combined forces to clash with these groups of ethnic minorities. And we are going to trace the events that led up to the 1943 civil uprising spawned by that young man's death in today's 105th episode of California Dreaming, the tale of the Sleepy Lagoon and the Zoot riots. On the evening of August 1st, 1942, Amelia Delgadillo was celebrating her birthday at a party at her house, which was located near the intersections of Slauson and Atlantic Boulevards, which is today in the city of Maywood. But at that time, it was an area referred to as Williams Ranch. Her family, along with somewhere between 20 and 30 other guests, were in attendance, and it's been estimated that there were approximately 8 to 11 individuals present who were uninvited. Music at this party had been provided by an orchestra, and they performed from about 9 p.m. until about 1 a.m. Once they wrapped up and left, the partygoers set up a radio in the backyard, and those who were still there continued dancing and partying for about 45 more minutes. This was now going into the early morning hours of August 2nd. Prior to midnight, some of the attendees had left the party and headed over to a small pond about a 5-minute walk away from the Delgadillo home, still within the confines of Williams Ranch. The kids who hung out there referred to the pond as Sleepy Lagoon. The group, and in order to differentiate them, we'll simply call them the 38th Street Boys, because that's what they will come to be referred to later on. They headed there accompanied by their girlfriends, or at least girls that they were interested in, as it was a place that they frequented, and it seemed on this night they were going over there to have some sort of confrontation with another group of boys from Downey. Now, these boys from Downey had actually been ones that shown up to the birthday party uninvited, and at some point in the evening, 2 of them got into a heated verbal confrontation with the host of the party, Amelia Delgadillo's husband, and his son-in-law, because the boys from Downey were told that they were out of beer. One of the boys picked up a chair and began to threaten to hit somebody with it. One of the other boys took him by the shoulders and pulled him away from the altercation towards the back patio area. So after these 2 group of boys had their confrontation at the Sleepy Lagoon, the 38th Street Boys fought with the Downey Boys. They would end up fleeing the scene and head about 5 miles or 8 kilometers away to the corner of Vernon and Long Beach Avenues. This is close to where the 38th Street Boys were from. It was known as the 38th Street neighborhood, and this is where they hung out. It is believed that they went there to enlist the help of some of their friends to go back to Sleepy Lagoon with them because they did not fare too well in the first fight with the Downey Boys. So the 38th Street Boys gathered up several more people, boys and girls ranging in age from 14 to 22 years old, and they headed back towards Sleepy Lagoon, taking several cars to make the trip. It is also believed that one of the group, a guy named Angel Padillo, brought a .22 rifle along with some ammunition with him, but that couldn't be completely confirmed as a firearm was never brandished at any point that evening. But when the 38th Street Boys got back to the Sleepy Lagoon, they discovered that the Downey Boys had left already. So some of the group left in their cars and went back to their neighborhood, but some of them, they continued to hear music coming from the Delgadillo house where the party was still going on. So some of them went there instead. What would go on to transpire next would be attributed to the boys' desire to find somehow, some way to get some sort of retribution for the fight that they had earlier with the Downey Boys. But the Downey Boys did not wait for them to come back to the lagoon. After some of the 38th Street Boys, along with an assortment of their girlfriends also in the mix, returned to the Delgadillo home, it seems as though what court documents described as a free-for-all fight ensued. Once the fight broke apart and things settled down a bit, the boys ended up leaving the Delgadillo home again. It was discovered shortly thereafter that there was someone lying in the dirt just outside the southern fence of the house. A young man named Jose Diaz. He was bloodied, unconscious, but still alive. Paramedics were called and he was transported to Los Angeles County General Hospital. Not long after arriving at the hospital, Jose succumbed to his injuries without ever regaining consciousness. An autopsy would later reveal that Jose was intoxicated. He had been an attendee at that birthday party. He had suffered a fracture at the base of his skull. The medical examiner could not say with any degree of certainty how this injury was delivered to him, just that it was consistent with possibly having been blunt force trauma caused by repeated falls, or maybe some sort of automobile accident, like possibly he was struck by a car. Though he did not mention the possibility of the injuries having been sustained by a beating, Jose's official cause of death was listed as undetermined, and it was also not specified as having been a homicide either, as he seemed to think it could have been an accidental death, But that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because he suffered stab wounds too. We will come back to Jose a little bit later. There was another thing going on around the time Jose Diaz died in Los Angeles, and it was a thing that had been happening for quite some time. The minority populations all over California, but in Los Angeles in particular, they were being targeted. With the removal of the Japanese in early 1942 into internment camps, along with the influx of Mexican Americans and African Americans, this caused the racial paranoia to shift from the Japanese to them instead. Mexican Americans were the primary focus, though other minorities were affected too. The media began referring to what was going on in Los Angeles as a Mexican crime wave. The city of Los Angeles began an investigation, and they convened a grand jury to conduct it, to look into this crime wave. But the county sheriff's department also launched an investigation of their own and formed a commission and appointed E. Duran Ayers to lead the charge. And basically what Ayers concluded was, and it's actually pretty ridiculous, so I'm sorry, but bear with me. According to an article on the Cal State University at Los Angeles' website, Ari stated that Mexican Americans are essentially Indians, therefore they are Orientals or Asians, and as had been demonstrated throughout history, the Orientals have shown less regard for human life than Europeans, and furthermore, Mexican Americans had inherited their naturally violent tendencies from the Aztecs of Mexico and suggested that Mexicans would forever remain wild with violent tendencies, no matter how much education or training they may receive. So yeah, that's who's in charge of this investigation into this quote-unquote crime wave following the influx of workers from Mexico. Which, remember, was a thing the U.S. government made happen with the Bracero program. So, go figure, right? This was a state of affairs in terms of what was going on in Los Angeles with law enforcement at the time of Jose's death. Okay, so back to Jose Diaz. I mentioned it was never really clear if Jose's death was an accident or a homicide according to the medical examiner. At least that's all he was willing to commit to. The autopsy revealed injuries that also included contusions to the back of both of Jose's hands, knuckles that had abrasions and were swollen. His face was swollen. He had contusions on the left side of both upper and lower lips, contusions on both sides of his cheeks, along with abrasions on the right side of his mouth, and an examination of his brain revealed it to be contused with profuse subdural hemorrhaging, and the base of his skull was fractured. As for the stab wounds, I wasn't able to find any information if any of these injuries were actually stab wounds or if they called them contusions. I don't know. Jose's blood alcohol content was believed to be somewhere between 0.12 and 0.15, as he did not die right away, and it is my understanding that some time had passed from the time the fight at the house occurred and the time that he was actually discovered, so his blood alcohol content may have been receding as he laid there unconscious. Now, even though the medical examiner couldn't say for certain if this was accidental or not, I can't see why, but he left the whole thing undetermined. And it's pretty clear from Jose's injuries and from what witnesses described in seeing the state of Jose's face and hands that he had been delivering punches and receiving them. But based on the severity of the skull fracture and the brain contusions and the subdural hemorrhaging, it appeared that he had been struck with an object other than a fist to cause an injury such as that. So then it said it may have been possible that he fell to the ground, or his head could have hit a rock or something like that. Now, in the documentary that I watched on this story, it did report that Jose was stabbed. You would never know that from reading the medical examiner's report, though. But everything about Jose's death is clear to me that this was not accidental in any way. I'm not a medical examiner, but that's just me. I'm not sure why it wasn't more obvious that Jose Diaz was clearly a person who had been beaten and stabbed to death, which technically makes this a homicide. But anyway, in documents it says that the medical examiner said it was undetermined, but it was indeed a homicide. Jose Diaz was 22 years old. At the time of his death, he was preparing to go to war, as were so many young men and women following the attack on Pearl Harbor. When Jose Diaz was stabbed, he was accompanied by two other people, friends of his, Jose Manfredi and Cruz Reyes. Manfredi suffered a stab wound less than an inch deep just below his heart and a fracture to the frontal wall of his sinus, a basal skull fracture, a concussion, and a broken left hand. He was also transported to the same hospital as Jose Diaz, and he did recover from his injuries and would be able to provide some testimony as to what happened. Cruz Reyes sustained injuries in the fight, including a stab wound to the abdomen and numerous contusions on his body. Both Jose Manfredi and Cruz Reyes said that they were stabbed close to the onset of the fight while they were still in the patio of the Delgadillo home, and later on they were beaten with some sort of steel object by several boys or young men on the eastern side of the Delgadillo house. As I had mentioned earlier, there was this climate of panic, for lack of a better term, when it came to Mexican-American youth in Los Angeles. I mentioned commissions were formed and grand juries were convened. So when Jose Diaz was killed, that would push the hysteria into overdrive. Now, before the war, if this had happened prior to Pearl Harbor, prior to the Japanese internment, prior to the Bracero program and the Second Great Migration, a Mexican kid killing a fellow Mexican kid, the LAPD could give a rat's ass about it. But Jose Diaz's murder happened at a time when they were ready to pounce on the criminal element they believed to be the Mexican-American youth. His death was going to be used as a catalyst to start coming down on the Mexican-American communities. The panic regarding the Mexican-American youth was being stoked by the local newspapers that were printing articles leading citizens to believe that basically the Japanese, they may be the national threat, but the Mexicans, they're the threat to the local communities. Everyone was suspicious that among them, they were enemies, that they could have possibly even been traitors or spies, infiltrators, that these Mexican youths were being used as agents for the Axis powers, that they were kids who had been deemed rebellious troublemakers and were being groomed by enemies of war. Yeah, the newspapers were perpetuating this junk, essentially feeding in to the fear and the panic. Now remember, Los Angeles used to belong to Mexico, and this was less than 100 years prior to the time our story here takes place. In this area that used to be a part of Mexico, Mexicans were now being considered the outsiders, despite the fact that Los Angeles was a city that had been established by their very own ancestors. So now, they're the ones that are the foreigners. Anyway, back to the investigation into Jose's death. The LAPD did have a prime suspect, a man named Henry Levas. He was one of the individuals who had been a part of the group attacked by the Downey Boys earlier at the Lagoon, which was a fight that caused Henry's group to head back to the 38th Street neighborhood to recruit more people to help with the fight. According to stabbing victim Jose Manfredi, he saw that Henry had both a knife and some kind of club in his hand while they were in the patio of the Delgadillo home. But there was no evidence that Henry was the one that stabbed Manfredi, because it was believed that another suspect named Ismael Parra was the one who stabbed him. Cruz Reyes, the other stabbing victim, also did not identify Henry Levas as the person who stabbed him either. But anyway, the witness accounts of what exactly happened vary wildly depending on who you talk to. And it was really hard to follow the investigation with so many different versions coming from so many different directions when it came to the court documents. And we will circle back to Henry Leyva's, and the story will become a little bit more clear later on. And there will be a number of other defendants as well involved in this case. So within just 2 days of Jose Diaz having been beaten and stabbed to death, the LAPD initiated a citywide dragnet which netted more than 600 young Mexican-American people. Pretty much if you were between the ages of 12 and 25, you were getting picked up. The only way to not get caught was to basically not leave your house. Word spread quickly. Everyone who was Mexican-American is going to be taken into custody, whether you had anything to do with the Delgadillo party and Jose Diaz's death or not. Now remember, the LAPD doesn't give a crap about Jose Diaz. They're using his death as an excuse to take these people, children too, to jail. Parents started keeping their kids locked up inside their homes out of fear of them being picked up in the dragnet, because police were swarming the neighborhoods, just grabbing at people. But, the LAPD had already been making a habit of picking on the Mexican Americans in Los Angeles neighborhoods. They really didn't have to be doing anything wrong. If a cop just felt like someone looked suspicious or like he was up to no good, they would just arrest them. If the officer thought that they were looking at them funny, or maybe they just didn't even look like anything at all, just kept a neutral look on his face, or didn't show the officer respect or whatever, they might get beat up. Now, when it came to Henry Leyva's, he was very well known to the LAPD. Whenever there was some sort of crime being reported, and the suspect was described as being a vague Mexican, Henry was always one of the ones getting picked up, regularly. Now, why is Henry so routinely targeted? Well, it was because he was considered to be trouble. But he also had an axe to grind when it came to the LAPD. He wouldn't just bow down to cops. He would be the one to stand up for himself and his civil rights. He would not go easy. He resisted when he was assaulted by police. He resisted when he was taken into custody, demanding to know exactly what he was being targeted for. He would contest their actions. He would take the cops to task. But police are almost always going to have the upper hand, especially back in those days. But leading up to this, Henry was on his way to possibly turning his life around too, because of World War II. He had just joined the Merchant Marine. He was about to not be around causing trouble. At the very least, not getting into trouble. I mean, things may not have worked out for either of these young men in the military, especially in wartime, Henry or Jose Diaz. But they wouldn't have been on the streets anymore. Both of them were getting ready to go fight for our country. And I was going through this case, I kept wondering, how many of these individuals' lives would have been different if they had just been left to be shipped off to war, instead of sent through the revolving door of going to jail, getting back on the streets, getting arrested, going back to jail, and repeat. It may not have been the answers to everyone's problems, but the officers could have been just like, you're enlisted? Okay, great. I don't want to see your ass back in my jail again. And just let them go. But the problem this time for Henry is that he wasn't just picked up because he resembled some ambiguous Mexican guy. Henry was identified by at least one witness, Dominic Manfredi, Jose Manfredi's brother, as having a knife in his hand when he saw him having a confrontation with the hosts of the party. Dominic said he witnessed Henry punch and kick Lola Delgadillo, the daughter of Amelia, the one who the birthday party was for. But when he saw that Lola's dad was headed his way and he had a knife in his hand, Henry shoved Lola away in an attempt to flee, and in doing so, That is when Dominic saw the knife in Henry's hand. As for the other stabbing victim that night, Cruz Reyes, several witnesses said that Henry was the one who attacked him too, but Cruz himself either would not or could not identify him as having been the one, though those witnesses did say they did not think Henry was attacking Cruz with any sort of deadly weapon. They saw him throwing punches, and he seemed to have some sort of object in one of his hands. Some said it was in his left hand, and Jose Manfredi said he saw Henry with weapons in both hands. But as you are listening to this, there really isn't anything that anyone witnessed that connected Henry definitively to having been the one to have stabbed Jose Manfredi, Cruz Reyes, or Jose Diaz, the one victim who died. But Henry was arrested, brought down to the 77th LAPD precinct, and held on suspicion of murder, along with hundreds of other Mexican Americans arrested just because of the color of their skin. Now, what this action on the part of the Los Angeles Police Department managed to do was essentially have the Mexican American community in a state of being essentially under siege. The community was forced to shut themselves in from the rest of the city. They turned inward and not really wanting to associate with anybody else other than other Mexicans. By the early 1940s, there were approximately 250,000 Mexican Americans residing in Los Angeles. And what they ended up doing was forming a succession of tight-knit neighborhoods known as barrios. And in the barrios, they were able to keep true to their Mexican traditions, surrounded by only other Mexicans, and they were completely self-reliant. All businesses were owned and operated by and catered only to members of their own community. But for Henry, he was among the youth and the rebellious who refused to be restricted to the limitations and the confines of the barrio. This was America, and he knew what was out there for him, and he refused to be denied that. And because of this divide between the barrio and the rest of the communities in Los Angeles, families started having to worry about their kids venturing out of what they considered their safe, self-contained neighborhoods. These young people were wanting to experience all the things on the outside of all things traditionally Mexican, with the strong desire to immerse themselves in American culture. The Mexican youth predominantly spoke English instead of Spanish, like their parents did and insisted on at home. They were picking up slang, especially from American music and television and movies, and their parents really weren't liking it all that much. And the economy during this time, since the United States entered into World War II, it was thriving. Jobs were plentiful, and these Mexican American kids, they had money. And when young people have money, they often spend it on the latest fashions, among other things. And one of the big fashion trends of the era were these suits. You'll be able to look it up if you're not familiar. I did post a picture on social media as kind of a teaser, but I'll try to describe them for you. The pants, they were like these really oversized pants. They were long and baggy, and they were pinned at the ankle. They were high-waisted pants. They'd be about 40 inches around the knee and slim all the way down to 10 inches at the ankle. They kind of remind me of hammer pants, just not as colorful, but they were plenty flamboyant. And the coats were oversized and they hung down really low, much lower than jackets today, as much as halfway down the thigh, even to the knees. It was a style first worn by African Americans, and it was known as the Zoot suit. It became very, very popular with young Mexican American men, especially when going out on the town, going to the nightclubs. The Zoot suit was what all the cool cats were wearing. And these things that these kids would do, they'd dress up in these Zoot suits, they'd head out of the barrio and go dancing at the many nearby jazz clubs. Their parents did not approve of this stuff. So a lot of times they'd have to sneak around. And what these Mexican American parents were afraid of most is that their children were turning into what they termed as pachucos, which meant they were being punks. Kids that were rude, they had bad attitudes, and they didn't have any manners. As much as the Mexican parents disapproved, the white people in the community felt like they were criminals and a threat to public safety. Every young Mexican person in their teens or early 20s wearing a zoot suit, to white people, they were all pachucos. The thing was, because they were rebellious, they weren't staying within the confines of the barrio, which essentially is a structure of segregation. The LAPD all but cornered them into congregating into small, tight-knit, enclosed communities, but the Mexican youth went against that and went into areas, often wearing these zoot suits, often with an air of arrogance that they weren't necessarily welcomed into, but they didn't care. White people didn't want Mexicans at the places that they frequented. They didn't consider them Americans. They weren't right, and they wanted them to stay confined in their own neighborhoods. And they even started putting up signs on businesses and restaurants and clubs and theaters and other public places that said, "No Mexicans" or "Anglos only." And this led to a sense of resentment and animosity towards whites on the part of Mexicans. There was another group of people that flooded into Southern California around this time too. Servicemen. There were numerous military installations in Los Angeles County at the time, including Fort MacArthur in San Pedro, the San Clemente Island Naval Test Site, Edwards Air Force Base, the Naval Air Station, the shipyard on Terminal Island, which is partly in Long Beach, partly in San Pedro, and the Air Force Base in El Segundo. There were more than 50,000 sailors in Southern California preparing to go to war. And while they were waiting, they wanted to spend time going to the nightclubs and the jazz bars and all the same places that the Zoot Suit kids and young men were wanting to go to. So why exactly was this tension building between Mexican Americans and the military servicemen specifically? Well, for starters, so many of these military men were from all over the United States and had likely never even seen a Mexican person before they were sent to California. They simply were not used to the diversity of the city of Los Angeles, and it was unlike anything they'd experienced in their own hometowns. But the culture was a bit of a shock. The interactions, the demeanor, and the manner in which Mexican American youths were with one another was just a lot to absorb for these servicemen that had no experiences outside their own little hometowns. They just didn't get it. And because of that, they didn't like it. And what ended up happening, as tensions continued to mount, confrontations on the street would ensue pretty frequently between the servicemen from the Naval Armory and the nearby Mexican neighborhoods known as Chavez Ravine. Because to them, this was their neighborhood. Who did these white servicemen think they were coming into Southern California trying to act like they run the place? Because you can imagine these guys coming to California fresh out of boot camp. Everyone is like super pumped up to get back at the Japanese, and not to mention the Nazis over in Europe too. So when they know they've got a night off, and they know they're about to be going to war, and they might not be coming back, they're trying to enjoy themselves. On those nights, these sailors would be out at the jazz clubs and the bars and whatever they were doing. While they were walking back to base, they would have to pass through the surrounding Mexican communities. So what the sailors started doing, because they began feeling like these young Mexican American men and boys were a threat, they started having pennies sewn into their neckerchiefs, as that was a part of their uniform which they wore even when going out. And if they were to have confrontations with any of the Mexicans in the neighborhoods that they passed through, they would be able to quickly pull off the neckerchief and swing it at them. I mean, for their part, it's been said that the sailors would be going by and the Mexican kids and young men would harass them and taunt them. But the servicemen would also hurl insults and say derogatory things as well. I can't say with certainty who started every single fight, but the white sailors didn't like the Mexicans and the feeling was quite mutual. They didn't want them passing through their neighborhoods. And with each fight, well, it would be just cause for another and another and another. And this was becoming a very real problem for the LAPD. They too had their issues with the Mexican American community in the city, but at the same time, this was wartime, and the best of their men were being deployed too. All the while, this trendy Zoot suit thing was exploding, and they made the decision that they were going to start coming down hard on the so-called Zoot suiters. They were perceived as being the big problem here, that they were the cause of the rise in criminal activity, along with all the conflict that was escalating between them and the servicemen. So, this was the climate of Los Angeles when Jose Diaz died. 48 hours after his death, a massive dragnet netted more than 600 Mexicans, and most of them were arrested for no other reason than being Mexican. And that is how Henry Leyva ended up in custody too. But his name had also been floated around as the prime suspect in the killing based on various witness reports to police. But he wasn't the only one arrested in connection with Jose Diaz's killing. 21 other Mexican boys and young men were also arrested. Yeah, the LAPD arrested 22 people, all of them being accused of having something to do with Jose's death. And when that happened, the news spread across Southern California like wildfire. And knowing what I've mentioned earlier about the biases in the media against Mexicans, you know that this is not going to go well for any of these people in custody, at least not in the court of public opinion. Now, for their part, all of these kids were like, yeah, we were involved in a fight, but killing somebody, that didn't happen. But the police investigating Jose's death, they did try coaxing a confession out of these young people, but they were doing it by way of intimidation. They were treated terribly by the officers, and I mean bad. The officers would be wearing leather gloves, and they would just start beating down on each of these young men, beating and punching and kicking them in the body and in the head and in the face. And all of this was a tactic that the LAPD used at the time to coerce confessions out of them. Not coax them, coerce them. But not one of them ever did. No one would say that they had anything to do with Jose's murder. They all maintained their innocence, even in the face of getting pummeled by the LAPD. Literally. And because Henry was thought to have been the leader of all these guys that were being accused of beating Jose Diaz to death, they beat him up the worst. His sister, Lupe, had gone by the precinct and asked to see him, and when she was brought over to where he was being held, he was seated in a chair, and his hands were cuffed behind his back and to the chair, and his head hung, and his whole face had been battered, and it was swollen and bloodied, and she barely recognized him. After a minute, Lupe was told, "There you go. You saw him," and then they ushered her out. Henry would later say that among the officers who beat him was the chief of the LAPD at the time, Clements Horral, but for some reason in the documentary, he's referred to as Clements Peoples. He became the chief on June 16, 1941, when his predecessor, Chief Arthur Holman, resigned under pressure stemming from corruption accusations, and would himself go on to resign 8 years later on June 28, 1949, under the same pressure from being investigated for police corruption. He was chief during this time of World War II beginning, the Japanese internment, the Black Dahlia case, and a vice scandal involving Hollywood Madam Brenda Allen, where some LAPD officers had some involvement with her and subsequently lied under oath to a grand jury. The chief also perjured himself, forcing him into resignation. And I really did not have the time to look up other chiefs, but I'm pretty sure there are plenty of them who were pushed out of office in the face of some sort of corruption scandal. Incidentally, the LAPD did not have an ethnic minority chief until 1992, more than 116 years since its first chief. And in its history, it has only had 2 black chiefs. And that is all. So, in the beginning of our story, what exactly happened at the party and the lagoon was very jumbled up based on so many witness accounts. Now, the story that would come from Henry himself would paint a clearer picture from his perspective. The 38th Street neighborhood kids decided to go over to the pond known as Sleepy Lagoon on the night of August 1st, 1942. Henry Levas was one of them. Earlier that night, it was him and his girlfriend and a couple of his friends that had been attacked by the group of boys mentioned earlier, the Downey Boys. They were now headed back to retaliate, and Henry was especially upset because they had roughed up his girlfriend too. When they drew closer to the lagoon, they heard the noise and music coming from that birthday party that had been the scene of much of what was to come. Henry then believed that the boys he was searching for might be at that party. So he and the group that he was with went crashing into the party, breaking things and roughing people up. The fight lasted about 10 minutes, and when the fight broke up, the boys all scattered. And that's when Jose Diaz was discovered clinging to life outside the house on the other side of the patio fence. The truth of what actually happened that night would not come out until many decades later, and we will come back to that. But for now, law enforcement has Henry, along with as many as 24 other young men, and a few girls too, on the hook for his death. This is how their journey through the justice system went. Henry would be facing trial with all the others arrested and charged along with him 2 months after Jose's death. And it would go down as the trial with the largest number of defendants in California history. The police chief was there at the trial as he had taken the lead into the investigation. Not only that, he would be the one providing written pieces about the trial for the local press. Yeah, the police chief was doubling as a courtroom journalist. That isn't biased or any sort of conflict of interest at all, right? Right. And Judge Charles Fricke would be the one presiding over the trial. So dreamers, let's stop here for a moment and talk about Judge Fricke. He wasn't randomly picked for this trial for no reason. This judge had a reputation as being a no-nonsense jurist, according to a 2006 Los Angeles Times article by Cecilia Rasmussen about his career. And just to give you an idea, by the end of Fricke's career, and he passed away in 1958 at the age of 76, he was known for having sent more defendants to death row than any other California judge, and he was assigned some of the most high-profile cases at the time. For example, Fricke presided over the trial of Alexander Pantages, of the Pantages Theater fame. Well, he was charged with statutory rape of a theater dancer who was only 17 years old at the time. Pantages' defense attorney attempted to make the victim out to have low moral standards herself, but despite Pantages' money and prominence, Judge Fricke refused to allow her character to be assassinated in court. And Pantages was convicted, and Fricke sentenced him to a term of 50 years. However, Pantages did go on to win an appeal. He was tried a second time and subsequently found not guilty. Judge Fricke also went on to sentence a man convicted of rape and kidnapping to death, which is still on the books in some states as a capital crime, but it is not a thing that ever happens. And it didn't really happen back then either, but Fricke did it. And the guy was put to death in 1960, 12 years after his conviction. And the most famous case Fricke would preside over would be our case today, the Sleepy Lagoon murder. One of the more remarkable moves Fricke made during the course of the trial, in spite of a volley of objections coming from dozens of defense attorneys representing the Sleepy Lagoon defendants, is that Fricke ordered them to be held separately from their attorneys. The conditions in the courtroom were so cramped, and it was overflowing with people, and Fricke had been losing his patience and pretty much blamed the defense for all of it. And apparently the defendants were acting out in court too, even shooting spitballs, which is said to be the main reason he didn't allow the defense attorneys to be with their clients as the 3-month-long trial was getting underway. Now clearly, that's a violation of the defendant's constitutional rights, but Judge Fricke didn't seem to care. Also, another big problem was the fact that none of the defendants were provided with clean clothing for trial, nor were they offered haircuts. Their attorneys tried several times to have Judge Fricke allow their clients to be more presentable for court, but he denied all of those requests too, citing that the way the defendants looked was not relevant, only the facts of the case is what mattered. And it was obvious that the jury looked at the group of defendants and they were offended by their appearance, offended that they didn't have the common decency to at least have a clean outfit and trimmed hair. According to the documentary I watched on this case, one person looking on from the courtroom was overheard saying that they looked like a bunch of vagabonds. So this trial is not going to go well. And Henry, he was very well aware that he was going to be portrayed as the leader of the group. The newspapers plastered his face all over the media and labeled him the so-called ringleader. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that when law enforcement pushed, Henry pushed back. He didn't take violations of his civil rights lying down. And because he was the most outspoken, this was all going to come down on him. Not to mention the fact that he was kind of a lot bigger in size and taller than most of the others. So that added to the perception of him being a commanding individual. The prosecution portrayed the defendants as a group of cold-blooded killers who operated at the behest of Henry Leyva. But they each testified on their own behalf, and they told their side of the story as to what happened that night. Yes, they had been driving around looking for the Downey boys, the ones that were said to have attacked Henry and his girlfriend and an assortment of his friends. They had left the scene to get more help from back at their neighborhood, and these were all of them, the defendants. They were going back to retaliate. And remember, I said that they heard music and noise coming from the birthday party near where the earlier attack had taken place, so they decided to look for the boys at the party. As they got close, a couple of the girls in their group had spotted something odd on the ground, and it was kind of obscured by the darkness. They went to get a closer look at the boys and continued on into the party. And what it was that the girls discovered was Jose Diaz laying in the dirt unconscious. He had been beaten and stabbed. His face and mouth was battered and bloodied, but he was still breathing, though it was very shallow. And that was it. Jose Diaz was already beaten nearly to death prior to the arrival of Henry Leyva and the rest of the 38th Street Boys, and prior to the fight that he was engaged in. Now, as the girls are kneeling down trying to see if there was anything that they could do to help or try and talk to him, Henry is leading the charge inside the party and going on the attack. This is what all the witnesses had been describing that I talked about earlier. Henry, with one, possibly two weapons in each of his hands, one of them possibly being a metal or steel instrument, he's in there smashing things up inside the Delgadillo house. But the fight didn't last long. It was quickly broken up, and the 38th Street Boys, including Henry, retreated from the scene. And as they fled, they told the girls trying to assist Jose to, "Come on, let's go." and they all left. And as they left, one of the boys in their group admitted that he saw Jose laying on the ground and hit him as he went by. And he admitted that on the stand. But they all said they had nothing to do with his death. He had already been beaten up before they ever got there. Now, as the boys were going on trial, something different was happening with the girls that were arrested and charged with this. There were 8 of them in all, the girlfriends of some of the members of the 38th Street Boys. They weren't going to be tried in court with the rest of them. The media had made a big, huge, sensational deal out of the fact that these girls were running the street with these boys, and they were fighting and creating havoc right alongside them. They had been called to testify against all the defendants in the case, but each one of them remained defiant and uncooperative. And one of those girls would later prove to have been a pivotal element in the story, Lorena Encinas. She had some pertinent knowledge of the case, and it was actually information that could have quite possibly changed the tide of the trial for each of these defendants. You see, Lorena, she knew who killed Jose Diaz, but she too remained silent, refusing to divulge anything that she had knowledge of. And she would keep this a secret for years, many years to come. And we will circle back to Lorena and what she knew later on in our story. And Henry's mom, well, she stood by and watched as the trial against her son and his co-defendants played out in front of the media and all of Southern California. She was certain that her son and all the other boys would be acquitted because she not only wholeheartedly believed in Henry's innocence, she believed in the justice system. Not sure why, considered how I've described what the climate was like in 1940s Los Angeles and how unfairly Mexican Americans had been treated as a whole. But maybe she was just hanging on to hope, and I can see that. I just know myself, and I would not have any kind of optimism in the face of something like this. So in January of 1943, after a 3-month trial, the case was sent to the jury. And before long, they had a verdict. 12 of the defendants, including Henry, were convicted of first and second degree murder. Not sure how or why they were convicted of both. I don't think that's a thing that can actually happen. But maybe it was a mixture of verdicts. Maybe some were convicted of first degree and some convicted of second. But whatever the case, 12 of them were convicted. The jury convicted 5 of the defendants on a charge of assault, and 5 others were found not guilty on all charges. Many of the mothers of the defendants were in the gallery of the courtroom, and there was a great deal of confusion since almost all of them didn't speak any English. But Henry's sister, Lupe, she was among them, and she and a couple of others did what they could to try and explain to them what was going on. The 17 that were convicted were all sent to San Quentin, hundreds of miles away from their families, to serve out their sentences. Henry, he was given a life sentence. As for the girls arrested along with them, well, an extraordinary thing happened. They were actually pulled from their homes and became wards of the state of California. The process they would go through would not require any kind of trial, because they were now essentially the responsibility of the state. So they were shuttled off to a reform school, the Ventura Home for Girls. And its reputation preceded it as being a program that patterned itself after state prisons. It was basically jail. They were locked in, the discipline was harsh, and the women dreaded being sent there, even going so far as to commit acts of self-harm, like swallowing pins and needles in order to sidestep having to go. And Lorena Encinas, with the information that she had about Jose Diaz's death, There was the opportunity to cut a deal to avoid being sent to the Ventura Home for Girls. It was a real possibility, and she could have avoided it if she had just spoken up, but she didn't. She went and served out her time at the reform school, opting rather to hold on to whatever secrets she had. So then another thing happened. And we have seen this occur in some pretty high-profile cases in recent years. Celebrities, prominent members of the community, influencers. They saw the injustice that went on with the 38th Street Boys and the conviction that they were handed that it was a farce, that they had been completely railroaded. And I'm talking about people like Rita Hayworth, Anthony Quinn, Orson Welles. They willingly lent their name to the cause. These activists banded together to form the Sleepy Lagoon Defense Committee, or the SLDC. And the call was for all of these young men to be given a fair trial, and they were able to gather the big names and the prominent individuals in order to raise money for their case. They believed that these young men had been imprisoned with absolutely no evidence to prove that any of them had a hand in Jose Diaz's death. And it was true. The boys were convicted on a trumped-up theory, biases in the courtroom, and biases in the media. It was like everyone needed a reminder that the Mexican-American community have the exact same constitutional rights as everyone else, and so many of their rights had been egregiously violated. Henry's sister Lupe recalled in an interview in the documentary as to being instructed by the SLDC to head over to the Beverly Hills Hotel. They wanted her to speak on behalf of her brother about his wrongful conviction. Bring something presentable to wear. They were going to send someone to pick her up. Well, Lupe really didn't have much other than what she normally wore, which was a basic style she wore to school, knee-high socks, a little black skirt, and a plain blouse. Well, they ended up taking her over to Rita Hayworth's house. And quickly, in case some of you aren't familiar with Rita Hayworth, she was born Margarita Carmen Cancino. Her father was Spanish, and her mom was of English and Irish descent. She was one of the most acclaimed actresses, dancers, and screen idols during the era that our case takes place. And she was a pinup favorite of the American servicemen during World War II. Throughout her career, she appeared in more than 60 films over nearly 4 decades. She had first been billed as Rena Cancino, but later on, as her career was on the cusp of taking off, she was given some advice that because her name sounded too Spanish, it might stifle her chances of getting bigger, more prominent roles in movies. So she took to using her mother's maiden name, Hayworth, and that is the name that she would go on to be best known by. Well, Rita had taken a vested interest in the 38th Street Boys conviction, and she was using her name to garner attention to the cause. So here goes young Lupe Leiva, trying to do what she can on behalf of her modest family and limited resources to fight for her brother's freedom. Here she is, headed over to the house of one of Hollywood's biggest stars at the time. And when Lupe got there, she met Rita. And Rita looked at her, and she was like, "Darling, you cannot wear this to the speaking engagement. Here, come pick one of my dresses." And with that, Lupe's very first formal dress was one that belonged to Rita Hayworth, of all people. And they went into this fight for the boys' innocence with guns blazing. Along with celebrities loaning their names to this, they had political figures, professionals in education, people associated with the labor union. And with all of these big names being thrown around, donations from all over the country began pouring in to help fund the appeal of the case. And Anthony Quinn himself went to San Quentin to visit the boys in prison, just to let them know, we've got your back. And just in case some of you aren't familiar with Anthony Quinn, he also was a very prominent actor, writer, and director in Hollywood at the time, having been nominated for 4 Academy Awards, winning 2 of them for several of his critically acclaimed movies. And like Rita Hayworth, he too had a name change in order to be more marketable in Hollywood, as he was Mexican-Irish American, born Antonio Rodolfo Quinn Oaxaca. Yep, he went to the jail and said, "We're going to get you out of here. We know you were treated unfairly, and we're working on getting this appeal pushed through. We are helping you." Following the trial and conviction, while the boys were in prison, waiting, tensions in the city of Los Angeles began to grow more intense. There wasn't a day that went by where a fight wasn't reported between servicemen and Zoot suitors. The newspapers referred to them as Zoot gangsters. It's been said that they tried to walk the streets, at least 5 deep, and they would go around taunting servicemen whenever they encountered them, even sometimes just hauling off and punching them unprovoked. But that is according to those who claim to have witnessed such things occur. The Zoot suitors were thought of as a nuisance, just out to cause trouble during a time that the country is being thrust into war. But the fact is, at least a handful of these young men were signed up to go, looking to take their lives in a different direction. Were these Zoot suitors perfect angels? Probably not. But they were rebelling against a society that was doing everything and anything it could to repress them, when the fact was that many of their families, their parents, they had been solicited by the U.S. government to come to this country for much needed help by way of the Bracero Project. They just wanted to be treated fairly. They wanted to be left to express themselves. And part of this expression, including the wearing of the Zoot suit, which we've discussed briefly. Let's pause here for a moment and talk a little bit more about it and why the outfit was such a point of contention for the servicemen. It is believed to be the first time in U.S. history that a fashion trend was the catalyst for a significant civil uprising, which we're coming up to. An article on the Smithsonian.com described the suit like this. With its supersized shoulder pads, sprawling lapels, and peg-leg pants, the Zoot suit grew out of the drape suits popular in Harlem dance halls in the 1930s. The flowing trousers were tapered at the ankles to prevent jitterbugging couples from getting tripped up while they twirled. By the 40s, the suits were worn by minority men in working-class neighborhoods throughout the country. Though the Zoot suit would be donned by the likes of Dizzy Gillespie and Louis Armstrong, it was not a costume or uniform for the world of entertainment, the Chicago big band trumpeter and clothier Harold Fox once said. It came right off the street and out of the ghetto. The point of the flamboyant outfit was clear. These young minority men wanted to be noticed. They no longer wanted to be pushed aside, and it would end up being a way for African Americans and then Mexicans to carve a place for themselves in American culture that was uniquely their own. But this was wartime, and therein lies the problem. With the U.S. entering into World War II, fabric began being rationed in March of 1942 when the War Production Board outlined new manufacturing guidelines for clothing that used wool in its production. And this would all but ban the production of Zoot suits. Most companies complied, but people still wanted Zoot suits, and the demand did not diminish because production did. So bootleggers continued to make them, while many already had their suits prior to the rationing going into effect, and they continued to wear them. Now, whether it was a bootleg purchase or previously owned, wearing this type of clothing that was so oversized, it was looked at as a waste of precious resources and considered to be a deliberate act of defiance, but it was also thought of as being unpatriotic. At the same time, the media was spinning these things around, making it seem as though the indulgence that these suits were thought to be was bordering on practically an act of treason. and they were often making them out to cost much more than they actually did in the press. It was wasting money and wasting resources, and doing that in this manner when this country is going into World War II, people were infuriated by it. This is why the servicemen took exception to these young men who donned these suits, when for the Mexican-American youth, what they were doing was fulfilling a desire to immerse themselves in American culture. They loved the trend of the Zoot suit. Everybody had one, and if they didn't, they really, really wanted one. Then, on June 3rd, 1943, the tensions between the servicemen and the Zoot suiters finally reached a fever pitch. Remember, ever since the conviction of the 38th Street Boys, the city of Los Angeles had essentially become a pressure cooker. So on that night, about a dozen service personnel had taken a bus to downtown Los Angeles for a night on the town. As they were walking up Main Street, they came to pass by a group of young Mexican-American men, all wearing Zoot suits. There are two different versions that have been described as having been the start of the confrontation between the two groups. One recounting of the story describes a verbal clash that ensued as they encountered one another. Another version describes one of the servicemen seeing one of the youths raising his hand or his arm in a manner that he interpreted as being threatening. So one of the servicemen took hold of this young person's arm, and from there, a fight amongst all involved on both sides began. Later on, the servicemen said that they were jumped by this gang of pachucos. The sailor who grabbed the arm suffered a broken jaw, and he was knocked out cold. His fellow sailors had to help carry him out of there. So that same evening, more sailors from the Naval Armory made their way to downtown Los Angeles, ready to join in the fight. And from there, the Zoot suit riots were set off. The fight had grown exponentially, and it was no longer just hand-to-hand, bare-fisted fighting. Sailors had wrapped gun belts around their hands, and they brought chains too. And the servicemen were pretty much getting the best of the Mexican Americans, beating up kids as young as 12. And all of it was over the way that they dressed, those Zoot suits that they liked so much. The following night, more than 200 sailors called in a whole bunch of taxi cabs, and they weren't headed to downtown Los Angeles, but rather into Southern California's oldest Mexican neighborhood, East LA. Why were they doing that? Well, essentially what they were doing was they weren't looking to find them enjoying an evening out in downtown. They wanted to go into their neighborhood and seek them out in their own territory, put them on the defensive by invading where they lived. Kind of like they were getting ready to do as they prepared to enter into the Pacific theater of World War II. Seek and destroy, so to speak. And that way, they didn't just have a bunch of kids in Zoot suits to attack like the previous night. They had everyone at their disposal. Anyone who was Mexican was targeted. This riot was escalating beyond these servicemen being offended by the way these Mexican youths dressed. Their attack expanded to include everyone who was of this specific race. This was a race riot. This was not a riot over Zoot suits. But the sailors, as a part of their attack, they were ripping the Zoot suits off of these young men and throwing them into piles and burning them. The media began converging on the area, and the news quickly spread, which led to more and more people converging on the area, picking sides, and joining in the rioting. The kids in the barrios, they were not simply going to back down and allow these sailors to come through their neighborhoods like this. They quickly mobilized and were prepared to fight back against the truckloads of sailors, along with civilians who wanted to support them, who were coming in droves. They were busting into nightclubs and bars and theaters and attacking any young Mexican men that they came across. Upon entering one theater where a movie had been playing, a group of servicemen forced two young men in Zoot suits onto the stage. They ripped off their clothes, They put it all into a pile and urinated on it, all while the audience looked on. Over the next few days, servicemen and civilians were coming from all over to join in the rioting to support the fight against the Zoot suitors. By the 5th day, more than 5,000 civilians showed up, siding with the sailors. They were using their own vehicles to help transport servicemen from other military installations into Los Angeles from as far away as Las Vegas. And they felt like they were providing a public service in doing so. The Mexican Americans were getting some help from the African American community, but really the odds were stacked against them. And this is because the LAPD were helping the servicemen by not helping. They weren't really doing much in the way of policing. They never took any action to quell the rioting. They would come in once the rioting had come and gone from a neighborhood, only to come through in their paddy wagons and make arrests, and they were arresting Mexican civilians only. Yep, the victims of the riots were being tossed into jail. As for the servicemen, well, they were being picked up too, but they were being given rides back to their military bases. The Mexican Americans were outnumbered, and soon they were overwhelmed. And the media really wasn't helping to make things better. They were reporting the riots as a cleansing of Los Angeles, ridding the streets of these unsavory individuals, these troublemakers, these hoodlums, these pachucos, referring to the Mexican American kids. And they conveniently left out the fact that white people were just as responsible for the mayhem as everyone else. But I'm sure that's not a surprise to any of you listening. It also should be mentioned that Mexican Americans, while they were the primary targets of the servicemen and civilians that joined them that day, African Americans who also wore zoot suits were also targeted in certain pockets of the city. So after several days of this bedlam, city officials were like, okay, maybe we need to do something before this really starts to get out of control. This was wartime, and the servicemen were actually acting in defiance of their commanding officers' direct orders to stay out of those neighborhoods. And this was going to lead to much bigger problems if they did not stop. So finally, on the 8th of June, military commanders ordered that all servicemen stay out of the Mexican neighborhoods, and they were ordered to stay in their barracks. And this is what led to the end of the rioting, at least in Los Angeles. Unrest had been breaking out in cities across California, as well as in other states, including Texas and Arizona, and similar incidents were reported in Detroit, New York, and Philadelphia. Then, on the 9th of June, the Los Angeles City Council banned zoot suits in public. A violation of this order could lead to 30 days in jail. And what did the military have to say about this? What was their stand on the whole thing? Well, their official statement was that their servicemen engaged in what were justified acts of self-defense. That's it. When they beat up a bunch of 12-year-olds, ripped their clothes off their bodies, set them on fire, or urinated on them, that was self-defense. Whatever. And the message was sent to the young Mexican-American people who had once believed that they could have their slice of Americana, that this really wasn't the case. They had been told, in America, you can be anyone you want to be. You can do anything you want to do. And you live any way you want to live because that is what America is based on. It was a big, painful reality check that it all felt like false promises. This American rhetoric was utter bullshit to them. Nobody died as a result of the 5-day-long civil unrest. About 150 people were injured, and 500 Mexican Americans were arrested. The governor of California wanted these riots to be investigated and ordered a committee to undertake the task of looking into the cause of the civil unrest. And I will go over the outcome of the inquest towards the end of the story. So while all of this rioting was going on across Los Angeles, the 38th Street boys that had been convicted of Jose Diaz's murder sat in prison hundreds of miles away from the whole thing. Jose's murder is regarded as being a main flashpoint of what was to come. Prior to his death, like I said earlier, Mexican on Mexican crime was no big concern to the LAPD. But with the sudden arrival of so many new Mexican workers, along with African Americans who came from the South to work in the defense industry, along with all the white servicemen converging on Los Angeles all at once, something had to give. And once Jose Diaz died, which prompted that massive dragnet, which in turn had the Mexican Americans wanting to turn inward and away into their own self-contained neighborhoods, the clear dividing lines had been drawn in the proverbial sand. The crisscrossing of servicemen and the young Mexican American men who loved their Zoot suits was going to be impossible to avoid. And then it finally exploded. The 38th Street boys were convicted because the judge, the media, and public opinion had already convicted them before they ever went on trial. And when trial commenced, the judge did a number of things, including denying several motions that clearly slanted the case in favor of prosecution by not allowing the boys to clean up or cut their hair or have clean clothing, separating them from their attorneys in court, which is totally a violation of their constitutional rights. And on a number of occasions, the judge lost his temper in courtroom, even yelling at one of the lawyers, which was totally inappropriate. But these kids, they had some big names in their corner. So in jail, while their appeal was being worked on, they were treated pretty well because of all the attention the celebrities on their case were getting. For example, they weren't getting regular old prison food. They were getting prison guard food, like the good stuff, meat and pork chops and steaks and all the yummy desserts. So it wasn't terrible. I mean, it's not great, but it could have been worse. But for Henry Leyva, he had a harder time than everyone else because he continued to not go along with the prison program. He resisted and he conflicted and he refused to conform, and he would end up being sent to Folsom, a prison notorious for being really tough. But finally, attorneys working on behalf of the 38th Street boys filed an appeal in November of 1943. The appeal was based on the contention that the boys were denied their constitutional rights to a fair and impartial trial. The decision cited numerous errors on the part of Judge Fricke. Well, duh. That's some understatement of the year. Well, it took a year for the decision to be made, but it worked. Their appeal was successful, and their convictions were overturned. One of their attorneys had sent the message to the prison via telegram on October 4th, 1944, that read, "Decision reversed. Victory. Will wire further details when I have them. Oh, what a beautiful morning. Much love." Shortly thereafter, Henry and everyone else he was convicted with were released from prison. But they weren't completely clear of the murder, though they never would be retried by the prosecutors. And as for Henry, well, his sister said in an interview in a documentary on this case that because of the trial, he was no longer eligible to join the Merchant Marine like he had planned prior to being arrested and convicted. And joining the service was something he had dreamed of doing. He'd even been issued a uniform, and she even shared pictures of him wearing it, but he never got to go. And what about Jose Diaz's murder? Nobody's being held accountable for it. Remember, there was one person who said to have information about his killer, but went to the reform school for girls, took those secrets with her, and refused to divulge what she knew. Fortunately, she didn't take those secrets to her grave. Many, many years would pass before Lorena Encinas would finally open up about the secret she had kept for so long. She was nearing the end of her life when she would finally reveal the truth. She told her daughter that the reason she could not tell law enforcement who it was that beat and stabbed Jose was because it was her own brother that did it. At least, he had a part in it. And she justified keeping quiet in that she wasn't one to rat on anyone, and it was important to her to keep her brother out of trouble. And I'm curious as to how you all feel about that, dreamers. Lorena had this information that could have spared so many others. 17 boys went to prison for a murder that she knew about it and her own brother had taken part in. She even got sent away to the reform school herself. What would you do? What would you do if it was your brother? I mean, fortunately, it worked out for the 38th Street Boys in the end. They won their appeal. But who knows how many of them would ever get their lives back on track? It's hard to say. But what is known is when they left the prison after their conviction was overturned, one of the guards made a comment that they'd be back. And that guard wasn't wrong. From the sounds of what Henry's sister had to say, his life was ruined. At least it would never be the same. And he and several of the other 38th Street Boys would spend many years in and out of jail. Henry would eventually pass away in 1971. And you know the girls who were sent to the reformatory for Jose's murder? There wasn't anything that an appeal could have done to help get them out. They weren't convicted of anything. They had been ripped from their families and turned over to the state. They were made to stay at the reform school until they turned 21. So what happened between Lorena Encinas' brother Louis and Jose Diaz? Well, Louis was one of the guests at the Delgadillo birthday party. But because he was acting up and causing trouble, he was asked to leave. And this was prior to the 38th Street Boys having shown up looking for the group that had attacked Henry, his girlfriend, and his friends earlier that same evening at the Lagoon. Jose Diaz was also a guest at the party along with his two friends, the other victims of the attack, Jose Manfredi and Cruz Reyes. They decided to head home, and as they were walking out and away from the house, that's when they encountered Louis and his friends, and they were still pretty pissed off that they had been kicked out of the party. And that's when a fight between the two groups of men commenced. And as a result of that fight, Jose Diaz had been beaten and mortally stabbed. Louis and his friends left as Jose lay dying. And it wasn't too long after that Henry Leyva and his group of friends arrived at the Delgadillo home looking for the guys that he had fought with earlier. So it was just a matter of really bad timing that Henry happened upon a beating and stabbing that occurred just earshot and eyeshot out of everyone at that party just when Henry walked in. And he fought with the partygoers for about 10 minutes, and then he left, and that's when Jose Diaz was found unresponsive, and witnesses, even though their stories were all over the place, they assumed it was Henry who had assaulted him. Ironically, Louis was one of the young boys taken into custody during the dragnet that saw about 600 Mexican-American boys and young men taken into custody for no other reason than being Mexican. But he was released not too long after. And the years following did not go well for Louis Encinas, and he would end up taking his own life. The committee that the governor commissioned did fault the LAPD and the media for their actions during the riots and found that the riots were racially motivated. They recommended that the LAPD be retrained to treat citizens of Los Angeles as equals. But knowing what we know about the history of the LAPD before and after World War II, it would take a very, very long time for anyone to affect any real change. And though progress has been made, it's a process that is still ongoing, and it's still taking way too long. But the mayor of Los Angeles, he had something different to say. He issued his own statement on the riots and said, "Nah, this wasn't even a race thing. These riots were incited by a bunch of out-of-control Mexican gangs. It's all their fault." I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that the governor's inquest was a little bit more accurate. I had never learned about the Zoot riots when I went to school. So I asked my daughter, who is half Mexican and very much chooses to recognize that component of her racial identity more significantly than my side. But, I can't blame her, I guess. But I asked her if she studied the Zoot riots, and she said, oh yeah, they did. So I'm thinking history isn't being as whitewashed as it used to be, because the Zoot riots is not a very flattering event for the U.S. military, the LAPD, the media, and society as a whole, because everybody was picking sides. The Zoot riots remain a key element in Mexican-American history and has continued to have a lasting impact. Some of those who defied convention, they found strength and inspiration to become civic leaders themselves in the years following, especially during the era of the civil rights movements. These are the people who would go on to stand up for the Mexican-American community when it came to equal treatment, equal access, equal pay, and equal housing. And with their civic leaders at the helm, advocating for them, organizing marches and strikes, they pushed for fairness for struggles that were exclusively their own by way of the Chicano movement, the refusal to be invisible in the face of racism, oppression, and a system biased against them. They were inspired, encouraged, invigorated, and led by the Zooters. They were those who took on white supremacy, mistreatment by law enforcement, and racially motivated violence against them without fear. They refused to be denied their Mexican-American dream and their rights to express themselves however and whichever way they wanted in a space that was their own. And that brings this episode of California Dreaming to a close. It is literally Wednesday, August 28th at 10:09 a.m. right now Pacific time, and I'm going to throw this episode up as soon as I possibly can, and I'm so sorry it took so long. I didn't really slack, but if you're on Patreon and you listen to that episode, you'll know why this took me so long. If you would like to discuss this case in more detail or any others that we have covered, please feel free to request and join the California Dreaming official discussion page. There we have cultivated an amazing community of listeners and true crime fans who share their thoughts and opinions on all of our cases that we cover, as well as true crime stories, other news events, TV shows that we enjoy, documentaries that we've watched, books that we've read. Whatever you find that you would like to come and share, please join us. You can also follow the show on Twitter at CaliforniaPod and Instagram at CaliforniaDreamingPod. And this week, I would like to wish a happy birthday to a couple that I missed last week, Lisa P. on the 12th of August and Holly P. on the 14th, Amanda W. on the 28th, Courtney M. on the 29th, and John P. on the 30th. Happy birthday. California Dreaming is proudly brought to you by the Orbital Jigsaw Network. We are a podcast production company located in Los Angeles, California, with a mission to create some of the best podcasts to listen to consistently improve upon our current roster of shows, to develop new content that appeals to people all over the world, and to provide a thriving community for listeners and podcasters alike. So please visit us at www.orbitaljigsaw.com. Thank you again so much for listening. I'm your host, Roseanne. I'm so glad I finished this today. Until next time, sweet dreams. If you would like more information regarding the Zoot riots, there is a pretty comprehensive video on YouTube with the same title, the Zoot riots. Some of the timeline and the facts of this case were obtained from that documentary. Thank you, Julia Ortega, for recommending this story to California Dreaming.
The neighborhood is unsafe, the streets unlit. While others sleep soundly, you lie awake because you know the truth. You know that, no matter where you go, there's always a chance that a monster is in your midst. The darkness that runs deep within our own veins, the evil found in even the sweetest of souls, sometimes comes to light. And when it does, the result is a person that takes on that evil, that wears it proudly, and becomes part of the darkness itself. I am Aaron from Devil We Know podcast. And on our true crime show, we dive into the scariest corners of our past and present to reveal the devil we know. A father, a mother, a brother, a sister, and anyone, anywhere who hides in plain sight, living a life of bloody secrets while living just next door. Come check us out and hear the chilling, true stories about the devils we know.